You are welcome to session 3 of learning, Psyc 337. Session 3 discusses classical conditioning. My name is Inusa Abdul Nasiru. Session overview, classical conditioning. We're going to be discussing classical conditioning. It's just one of the different types of learning processes. We mentioned earlier that there are different types of learning processes, and we discussed briefly learning by association. This is just one of them, classical conditioning. So this session will take you through the history of classical conditioning and explanations of the key features, so you can apply the concepts to everyday life situation. So the objectives for this session is to get you to be able to define what classical conditioning is, to outline the historical antecedents of classical conditioning, explain the elements and features of classical conditioning, and then get you to also understand and be able to discuss the factors that can affect classical conditioning, as well as explain how this type of learning can be applied in human situation, especially when it was used in studying animals first. So to help us do this, we have these topics that we're going to be discussing. We first start with history of classical conditioning by Pavlov. So we look at Pavlov's discovery, and then look at what is classical conditioning. Then move on to look at elements of classical conditioning. And that will set the stage for us to look at the next topic, Pavlov's experiments and features of classical conditioning. Then there are factors that affect classical conditioning. We'll look at these factors and then move on to see how we can apply classical conditioning principles to human situation. There are some relevant chapters that have been put on Sakai for you as reading list that I will advise you go there, read further on this session, so you will understand this better. We're starting with the first topic. We're going to look at the history of classical conditioning, which outlines Pavlov's discovery of these important concepts. So it started in the early 1900s when a Russian psychologist, Ivan Pavlov, investigated the way the body digests food. Routinely, he would put meat powder in the dog's mouth and measure the salivation. He would do this for several days, several times with dogs, mainly. He discovered that after a few sessions, precise measurements were impossible because the meat powder was not the only thing that causes the dog to salivate. There are some other things. Because he was observing some of the possible things, and he realized that the mere sight of food bowl or even the sound of the experimenter's footsteps was enough to let the dog salivate. So he recognized that the dog's association of these sights and sounds with the food was an important type of learning, which later on became known as classical conditioning. This was discovered by accident, actually studying salivation leading to a different observation, which became a big thing in psychology. So Pavlov observed that the dog's behavior included both learned behaviors and unlearned components. So there are two main things over there, learned and unlearned components. What are the unlearned parts? The unlearned parts are that some stimuli automatically produce certain responses apart from prior learning. These are inborn. They are innate. They are not supposed to be learned, or they are not a learned part. Whereas we have the learn aspects. That is, some stimuli can produce certain responses only when other stimuli are present. We'll look at this further when we look at the next topic, what classical conditioning is. It's been looked at as a learning process in which a neutral stimulus becomes associated with a meaningful stimulus and acquires the capacity to elicit a similar response just like the meaningful stimulus. So here, learn association involves the link between two stimuli, the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus. We'll explain this further. An organism learns a response to a neutral stimulus that normally does not bring about that desired response. It's the association between these two, the neutral stimulus and unconditioned stimulus, that generates a kind of learning that we're talking about. So in cluster conditioning, a previously neutral stimulus comes to elicit that desired response through its association with a stimulus that naturally brings about a response. So a neutral stimulus here will represent with NS, becomes associated with an unconditioned stimulus, which is UCS, and this will elicit a kind of response which is conditioned response, learned response. We'll give you further examples on this when we look critically at what can constitute a neutral stimulus and what is a UCS in our next topics. So the elements of classical conditioning. We first look at unconditioned stimulus, the UCS. What is it? It's a stimulus that brings about a response without having been learned. That is, there is no prior learning. It does not involve learning. It is innate. It is inborn. That stimulus is inborn. Unconditioned response, it is that unlearned response which is not learned, that is automatically elicited by the unconditioned stimulus, such as salivating at the smell of food. It is not something that will have to be learned. Seeing the food automatically will elicit some response in terms of salivation. So here, if you want to look at the UCR, that's the unconditioned response, and then look at the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned stimulus will there be the food or the meat powder. The salivation, which is also automatic and unlearned, becomes unconditioned response. Unconditioned because they are not learned. Unconditioned because they are not learned. So the term unconditioned is used because the response does not depend on any previous experience or conditioning with the stimulus. The response is innate. The response is inborn, and it does not require any learning. That is why we use the term unconditioned. So when you see unconditioned stimulus, it means a stimulus that is innate, that is inborn. It doesn't require any learning. Unconditioned response, the same thing, response that does not have to be learned. That comes automatically. Example is smelling the food and salivating. Neutral stimulus, on the other hand, is another element that we need to consider. This is a stimulus that normally will have no effect on the desired response. A stimulus that normally will have no effect on the desired response. It will not get the organism to elicit the targeted response. It is neutral. It has no relationship whatsoever with the unconditioned stimulus. So if the intention is to pair it with a neutral stimulus to see how the organism will respond to it after some time. That's the intention, to get the neutral stimulus to be paired with natural stimulus, to see how the organism will learn to respond to this neutral stimulus after some time. when the association between the neutral stimulus and the natural stimulus, which is the unconditioned stimulus, have been established. The next two terms are the conditioned stimulus and conditioned response. We mentioned earlier that condition means learned. So conditioned stimulus, a previously neutral stimulus that eventually elicits the conditioned response after being associated with the unconditioned stimulus. So initially, if there was a neutral stimulus that was paired with a natural one or an inborn one, a time will come that the neutral stimulus will acquire the properties of the natural stimulus, but it cannot be the same as the natural stimulus. So we term it conditioned stimulus. Conditioned response is the response that the conditioned stimulus will elicit. The response the conditioned stimulus will elicit. The response that occurs after the neutral stimulus and unconditioned stimulus have been paired. It is a learned response. So another term for conditioned response is learned response. Learned response. Now let's look at some examples that will bring all the elements together. Neutral stimulus, conditioned stimulus, unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, and conditioned response. Let's look at this. If a teacher always screams at students in class and that frightens them, it will come to a time when just the sight of that teacher or even the mention of the teacher's name will eventually frighten them. Let's analyze this. The first one is neutral stimulus. This is the initial sight of the teacher or the mention of the teacher's name. Initially, it has no relationship at all to frighten. It will not have any effect on the students. Just mention the name alone without any reason will not have any effect on the student. They will not be frightened if they hear the teacher's name initially. Initially, the same way, the screaming is unconditioned stimulus because naturally screaming elicits natural response of fear. So the fright is the unconditioned response, a response that is towards the natural or the unconditioned stimulus, because we naturally respond to scream with fright. So that one is natural. It doesn't involve learning. It doesn't involve any conditioning. Then later on, after the teacher has been screaming and screaming always at the students in the class and so on for some time, the students will then learn to associate the teacher's name with screaming, and which would elicit fright in them. So later on, the sight of the teacher or the mention of the teacher alone can bring about fright, and this is conditioned stimulus. That's the mentioning of the teacher's name's conditioned stimulus, and the fright at the sight of the teacher is a conditioned response, a response to the screaming, which of course there's the name alone, which initially was nothing, now has taken the conditions of the screaming, and so the mention of the name alone brings about fright in them. A conditioned stimulus elicits conditioned response, which means that is the conditioned response to conditioned stimulus, whereas there is unconditioned response to unconditioned stimulus. So it's unconditioned stimulus that elicits unconditioned response. We'll look at this in a diagram later on. Just take some time, go through these questions, try to look at them as we prepare ourselves for the next slide. Read the following carefully and identify the learned and unlearned behavior. You mark them, mark an L if you think the behavior is an example of learned behavior, and UL if you think that the behavior is an unlearned example. We have a child who has a fear of dogs. What is it? You indicate appropriately. Try yourself and go back to the notes and get the responses that will be okay for the questions. Let's prepare ourselves for the next topic. Topic 4, Pavlov's experiments and features of classical conditioning. Now we're going to apply our understanding of the UCS and UCR, CR and CSs into an experiment that was conducted by Ivan Pavlov. We want to look at that. His experiment, Pavlov's experiment. In studying a dog's response to various stimuli associated with the meat powder, Pavlov rang a bell before giving meat powder to the dog. So what do you think? Ringing of the bell, is it enough to get a dog to salivate? We'll look at that. Then what do you think about the meat powder? Meat powder to the dog, is it natural? Is it learned? Is it, if the dog responds to the meat powder by salivating, do you think it's a learned response or is a natural response? Think about it. So when initially Pavlov rang the bell, until then, ringing the bell elicits only a neutral reflex such as waking the dog up from a short sleep, or because the bell was a neutral stimulus. It doesn't have anything to do with salivation. It's neutral because it did not elicit the targeted response of salivation. After pairing the bell and the meat powder for a long time, the dog began to associate the sound of the bell with the food, that's the meat powder, and then salivated when it heard the bell alone being rung. This is because the bell had become a conditioned stimulus or a learned stimulus. So the salivation to the bell is a conditioned response. It's a learned behavior. So what happens is, before the learning, before conditioning, the bell and the meat powder were not related. But after the association for some time, the conditioned stimulus, which is the meat, the conditioned stimulus, which is the bell, the conditioned stimulus, which is the bell, now produces conditioned responses, which is salivation, which produces conditioned responses, salivation. So let's look at it in terms of illustration. So we want to have a summary of how classical conditioning works using Pavlov's experiment for the demonstration that follows. So we have neutral stimulus in the experiment. That's before conditioning. The neutral stimulus is the bell, ringing of the bell. And it elicits a kind of response, which is waking the dog up. So that's before conditioning. So what it means, the bell is presented alone, and it produces a response such as waking the dog from sleep. And at the same time, before conditioning, naturally, before learning takes place, there is this unconditioned stimulus, which is the meat powder, naturally will elicit a salivation, which is also unconditioned response. That the meat powder is presented alone and it produces an unconditioned response, which is salivation. So this is what happens before conditioning. Now, during conditioning, we have a bell being rung. A bell is presented first, followed by meat powder, and the dog will salivate. So you have a bell plus the meat powder, and the response is salivation. So NS plus UCS gives salivation, which is UCR. Remember that naturally the dog will salivate at the meat powder. Now we are pairing the bell and the meat. We are targeting at getting to see how the dog will respond to the bell after some time. Now, the dog salivates because of the presence of the meat, as we mentioned. This pairing of the bell and meat is done in several trials in order for an association to be formed between the two stimuli, that's the bell and the meat powder. Now, after some time, after several trials, we have after conditioning. The bell alone is presented and the dog salivates. So the bell, which initially was a neutral stimulus, now is a conditioned stimulus, and the salivation that comes with it is a conditioned response, which is a CR. So what it tells us is that the dog now responds by salivating at the bell alone. This is after an association has been formed between the bell and the meat powder. And because the dog has been conditioned to think that it will be followed by meat powder, whenever the bell is rung, it salivates at the sound of the bell, anticipating the coming of the meat powder. So that explains the situation of pairing a neutral stimulus and a natural stimulus, like the bell and the meat powder. You've seen all that. Now, there are situations that can be described as higher order conditioning. Situations where we have a second neutral stimulus that will be paired with a conditioned stimulus. Remember that our conditioned stimulus now, which is the CS1, which is the bell, initially it was a neutral stimulus, but after the first experiment of pairing it with the meat for several times, it began to elicit response, and so it became a conditioned stimulus. Now we want to see how we can add a second neutral stimulus. So we clap. We have a situation where the experimenter will clap before ringing the bell, and there is salivation. Of course, the salivation was to the bell, which already has acquired the properties of the meat. And so there is response of salivation. When there is a clap and the bell, there is salivation. Once the dog is conditioned to salivate at the sound of the bell subsequently acts as a UCS, as it is paired with another neutral stimulus, which is a clap. Now, when this is done for some time, for a very long time, it gets to a point where even the clapping alone, which initially was neutral, now will become a conditioned stimulus, and it will elicit salivation. Remember, this will have to go on for some time for the second one, which is the higher order cognition, to occur. So we have pairing of a second neutral stimulus with the first one, which is now conditioned stimulus, to generate or to elicit a response. After some time, the second neutral stimulus, clapping alone, is now eliciting a neutral conditioned response, which is salivation. So we call it CR2. We call it CR2. So that is for summary of how the experiment went. But all along, we've been talking about the experiments. We just want to show you a picture of how this Pavlov's experiment room. Below the picture that shows how Pavlov used the dog and measures salivation. So this is the dog, and this tube goes in, it takes the salivation into this, which is then measured later on. There are several of these pictures that you can have access to in the textbooks of learning and most intro textbooks of psychology that explains further what this is. Thank you for your attention for the demonstration. Now let's continue with the explanations. Features of classical conditioning. Features of classical conditioning. Acquisition is one of them. It is the development of conditional response, that is CR, as a result of the continuous pairing of CS and the UCS. It's the process by which an organism learns the association involved in classical conditioning. So acquisition is that process. So during conditioning, the strength of the CR, that's the conditioned response, gradually increases as the conditioned stimulus is paired with the unconditioned stimulus repeatedly. So there's acquisition where we have learning taking place. Factors that can affect acquisition. Sometimes we want to find out what are some of the factors that can affect the extent to which there can be acquisition. That is how the organism will learn the association that is involved. The first one is the strength of the UCS, the extent to which the natural stimulus or the unconditioned stimulus, the extent to which it is strong, can affect the strength of the acquisition or the intensity of the acquisition. Then the next is how salient the conditioned stimulus is, can also affect the intensity of the acquisition. And also the timing of the presentation of UCS is something that can also affect the strength and also the intensity of the acquisition. And then contingency. Contingency can also affect the intensity of, that is the extent to which the presentation of the UCS is contingent on the bell, which is the neutral stimulus initially. Certain procedures require several pairings to produce CR2. Others produce sex rapid conditioning, that is a single pairing is sufficient. It depends on what is used. Of course, you know how dogs like meat and bones and so on. So the kind of response that the dog is likely to elicit when a neutral stimulus is paired with meat will be stronger and intense, more intense than when the UCS is something else and not meat. That's why we're talking about the strength of the UCS. The second feature of classical conditioning is extension. This is the process of unlearning a learned response as the CR because of the removal of the original source of learning, that's UCS. So here we're talking about a situation in which after the dog salivates to the meat and now pairing the meat and the bell, the dog now salivates to the bell. It comes to a point when the meat is taken away, it gets to a point where the salivation that the dog will be giving to the bell will be reducing until the point that it extincts. So that is the unlearning bit of the CS. If the UCS no longer follows the CS, that is, if the bell doesn't come again after if the meat doesn't come again after the bell is rung, if the meat doesn't come again after the bell is rung, it gets to the point where the CR, that's the conditioned response, becomes weaker over time and eventually stops occurring. Extension in this way occurs when an already conditioned stimulus is presented alone without a UCS, which results in the decrease and eventually disappearance of the CR. So if gradually the bell is being rung and no meat is brought, the bell is being rung, the dog will salivate at the bell alone. No meat is brought, the bell will be rung, no meat is brought. For a very long time, the dog will stop salivating at the bell. And this is extension. It's important to note that the magnitude of conditioned response, that's the CR, gradually decreases with the number of trials in which no UCS occurs. It's important to also note that extension does not mean that the CR no longer exists. It is merely suppressed. So what this means is that that process of the dog salivating at the bell alone, when it becomes weaker and weaker and finally extincts, it doesn't mean that the learning to salivate at the bell is totally gone. No, it is there, only that it has been suppressed. We will get to a point in subsequent sessions where you will learn that there is a way to bring back some of this suppressed learning that has taken place by the dog salivating at the bell alone. The next feature is spontaneous recovery. Spontaneous recovery, which is the reacquisition. That is the process by which the CR recurs, as I mentioned just a while ago. The CR will come again after a time lapse without further conditioning. So what it means is during extension, the CS-UCS association is not eliminated totally. It is only suppressed. It can come back again, and when it comes back again, we call it spontaneous recovery. That is the situation in which the dog again will begin to be salivating at the bell only without meat. Spontaneous recovery of the original acquisition. That is what it means. That is what it means. So this is one of the features of classical conditioning. The next one is stimulus generalization. This is the tendency for a different stimulus, which is similar to the original CS, to produce a similar response as the original CS. The tendency for a different stimulus, which is similar to the original CS, that's conditioned stimulus, to produce a similar response as the original CS did. So there is the possibility for another stimulus which is similar to the conditioned stimulus to elicit a response without being paired with the UCS. I'll give you an example. It is important to note that the greater the similarity between the two stimuli, the greater the likelihood of stimulus generalization occurring. And note that the stimulus response, the condition response evoked by the new stimulus is not as intense as the original response. Let me give you a very practical example. We have a situation in which there is already a stimulus that has been paired. It may be neutral initially, but because it was paired with unconditioned stimulus, it has acquired the properties of eliciting some response. If it comes to a point where another stimulus, which is just almost the same as the first one, also brings out some responses without pairing it with the initial natural stimulus, we call this stimulus generalization. An example for this stimulus generalization can be you being in the house and the kind of reaction you have when your dad is coming home. For instance, you may have a bicycle, he'll ring the bell, or he has a vehicle, a car, he'll just blow the horn. You know the sound of your daddy's car horn. And so, anytime it's getting closer to the gate, just blows the horn, and then whoever is there at the gate come and open, and the daddy enters. At that point in time, whatever you were doing, maybe you might have done something, you were expecting your dad to come and react to it in a way. So that response that you have towards your dad, you learn to be responding that anytime you hear the bell or anytime you hear a horn of a vehicle. If this kind of response to the horn of a vehicle is extended to any other horn that you hear around or any other sound that comes about, even though it's not your daddy's, you want to respond to such sounds and the horns and so on, then you are generalizing to the other sounds. An example of stimulus generalization. An example of stimulus generalization. On the other hand is stimulus discrimination, which is another feature. The situation where an organism responds to certain stimuli but not to others. So you see, an organism eventually can discriminate between two or more similar stimuli. All this means that you can learn to respond differently to different stimuli that are distinct from the conditioned stimulus in some dimensions. For example, we learn to distinguish between a dog and a wolf, just as we distinguish between the red light and the green light of a traffic light. The kind of response you exhibit or you elicit when the red light turns on when you are driving is different. Red light means stop, green means go. So when it's red, you stop. When it's green, you go. So you are discriminating in terms of your responses to the various stimuli. So you can see that this looks like the opposite of stimulus generalization, where you see red light, you stop. You see green light, you stop. Which means that you see any light at all that you see, because you are the traffic light, you stop. Which one becomes stimulus generalization? You are generalizing your responses to all stimuli because they are all light. Stimulus generalization. Whereas for the discrimination, stimulus discrimination, that one you respond specifically to stimuli and differently. You see red light, you stop. You see green light, you go. Stimulus discrimination. Then we have another feature, higher order conditioning. We mentioned this earlier, and we even explained it, but let's look at it again as a feature of classical conditioning. There is higher order conditioning if already established conditioned stimulus, that's CS, is paired repeatedly with another neutral stimulus until such a time that the neutral stimulus evokes the targeted behavior, the same response as the unconditioned stimulus. Then we call this higher order conditioning. It means some additional neutral stimulus is added. It can be 1, 2, or 3, depending on how many you are able to do. It's important to note that the original conditioned stimulus acts in effect as UCS, and this is called second order conditioning. If you do it more, then it becomes higher order, third order, and so on and so forth. Example, in Pavlov's experiments, after the dog has learned to salivate at the sound of a bell, then it is repeatedly exposed to a light followed by the bell without presenting the meat powder. Later on, when the dog sees the light and hears the bell, it will begin to respond to the light by salivating. So these additions and so on generates the second order, the third order, the higher order conditioning that we're talking about here. Let's do a little demonstration here again with the explanation of this higher order conditioning. So, as you can see, we have the example of higher order conditioning. Initially, the bell and the meat comes, and then there is salivation. That is conditioned stimulus, and the UCS, which is the unconditioned stimulus, comes, and then we have unconditioned response. In the second order, then after that pairing for some time, it gets to a point where only the bell is able to elicit response of salivation. Then the third version is that you now bring in a different or a second neutral stimulus, which is light, before the bell. You know already the bell has acquired the properties that elicit salivation. Therefore, now the bell is now serving as the UCS. So now the bell is, you bring the light and then the bell, and you get salivation. Then after pairing this for some time, it gets to a point that the light alone is able to bring about salivation. So here, if you look at the shots, the initials, we have CS2, which is the second neutral stimulus, plus CS1, which is our original conditioned stimulus, eliciting condition response. Then later after association has been formed between the two, then the CS2 alone, which is light, now is able to elicit salivation, which is CR2. You bring the 2 and the 1s just to separate them to differentiate between the original and the second neutral stimulus. All right, so that's this for this demonstration for the higher order conditioning. So we are on the last feature of classical conditioning, and this is the last slide for session 3. So it's overshadowing. Overshadowing is a situation where two stimuli are presented together as a compound, and one completely dominates or overshadows the other, even though both will be perfectly effective if presented separately. So when one overshadows the other, we call it overshadowing. So when 2 or more CSs are paired with a single UCS, the more salient of the 2 CSs will produce the strongest of CR. For example, flashing lights and a siren are both predictors of an emergency vehicle. But most of us have a stronger response to one of them than the other. So flashlight and the siren, which one will you respond to strongly? The obvious one is the siren. It tells you there's an emergency vehicle approaching. It comes about if one stimulus is more salient than the other. In this case, the siren and the flashlight. The siren is stronger and overshadows the flashlight as predictor of emergency vehicle coming. So this is by way of conclusion for the session 3. Thank you very much. Let's prepare ourselves for the next session.